Two guys in the dark. When I was 21, I transferred to a college in San Francisco. I checked out a room for rent on Craigslist. It was in a really nice 2-bedroom apartment. It was cheap rent and close to campus, so it was the ideal spot. The girl who lived there was 29. Her name was Beth. She was tall and wide. She had jet black hair and wore pale makeup. She seemed pretty nice, although she was a little quiet. But she seemed to like me and agreed to let me move in. So far, so good. My next night there, we went out for pizza, and that's when I could tell that something was a little bit off with her. Throughout dinner, she kept telling me how much I looked like Shia LaBeouf. I didn't know what to say, so I just shrugged it off with a thanks. I mean, I look nothing like him, so it doesn't make any sense to me. When we got back home, she asked if I had seen her room yet. I told her no, so she took me to go see it. Her walls were covered in posters of Shia LaBeouf. She even had printed out posters of him all over her mirror. She owned all of his movies. I didn't know what to make of it. It was pretty creepy. The whole night, she had been saying that I looked just like him, and now it's obvious to me that she's obsessed with this guy. A few weeks had passed. I never really saw her that much. We didn't spend any time together, really. She would come home from work, practically run to her room. She'd spend the whole night in there. She had this creepy high-pitched giggle, and I could hear her giggling through the walls all night long. I wondered what the hell she could possibly be doing in there. Occasionally she would come out and talk for like 2 minutes. Then she would be slurring her words, so I suspected that she was drinking a lot. Sometimes she didn't say anything, and she would just stand in the hallway and watch me in the living room. I would turn and see her, and be surprised, and then say, "Oh, hello, Beth." And then there would be this long, awkward pause, and then she would give out her creepy, high-pitched giggle. It was uncomfortable being around her. She gave me the chills. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard what sounded like the front door being unlocked. I came out of my bedroom, and all the lights were off, but I could still see Beth standing at the front door. She had her face against it, and she was turning the lock back and forth, over and over again, and every time she turned the bolt, she would mumble my name. Seeing her standing in the dark and mumbling my name really freaked me out, and it didn't help that she kind of looked like a bigger version of a girl from The Ring. I just quietly went back to my room and then tried to sleep. One night I was watching Gladiator. She stumbled out of her room and turned on the living room light, forcing me to pause the movie, which was pretty annoying. She then asked me if I wanted to hear about her ex-boyfriend. It was an uneasy segue into the topic, but I just said sure, and then awkwardly sat back to listen to her. 10 minutes into her story, she was so riled up that she was screaming at the top of her lungs about their breakup. I was worried that the neighbors were going to call the cops. She wasn't listening to me when I was asking her to lower the volume. Amidst all of her screaming, one thing she said really freaked me out. She was in such a fit and yelled, "I'll slit your fucking throat." That was a big game changer. Suddenly I had no idea what this girl was capable of. She was practically a stranger, and everything I had seen had been alarmingly disturbing. After a few more minutes, she told me thanks for listening. And then she started doing her giggle. I got out of there pretty fast, went to my room, and then went to sleep. I had a pretty unsettling feeling about being in that house with her. And what's worse is that there was no lock on my bedroom door. I pushed the edge of my dresser in front of it to act like a little barricade. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dresser scraping against the floor. Beth was pushing the door open. I turned on my light, shouted at her to stop. I could see her through the opening of the door. She was so drunk and had this insane look in her eyes. I pushed the door closed, and then I yelled at her to go to bed. I could hear her walk back to her room, but I couldn't fall asleep. The next morning, when I went into the hallway, my heart dropped. I saw one of her steak knives was on the floor by my door. I got goosebumps all over my arms. All I could think about was her saying that she would slit this guy's throat. I confronted her about it. She said she didn't remember trying to push open my door. She said she didn't even remember telling me about her ex. I had enough. My lease was month to month, so I found a new spot and then moved out. About a month after I moved out, she had contacted me. I was at the movies and my phone was off. When I got out, I turned my phone on. And to my shock, I received 40 plus text messages that she had sent me over the past 2 hours. They were all just insane texts that ranged from everything between, "Hi, how are you?" to "I fucking hate you." It was insane. I didn't respond, and I never heard from her again. I always wondered if I hadn't set my dresser in front of my door, would she have quietly come into my room and then slit my throat? It freaks me out just thinking about it. So I'm female, late 30s, and I'm a travel counselor for a large tour company. We're pretty well known, so I'm not going to be dropping any names for the anonymy's sake. That being said, what occurred here is 100% for real. And yes, I know a lot of people claim that their stories are true, but you'll just have to take my word for it. So as a travel counselor, fancy schmancy way of saying travel agent, I book mini cruises. Both my company and the many cruise lines offer us in the industry what's known as a fam trip to familiarize us with the cruise line offers. So I was approached 2 weeks before the holiday with the chance to take such a trip. On a 4-night cruise to the Baja Peninsula. It left the day after Christmas. Since my husband had a big guy's trip with his BFF lined up, I thought that it was perfect. My in-laws have been begging us to watch our 7-year-old daughter. So she went to the grandmother's, and I went on a free cruise. What could go wrong? A little sand, surf, sun, and while it's winter, 66-degree days are much warmer than the teens, and below zeros we have up north. The flight was perfect. The embarking went as smooth as butter. The lovely balcony room I was put on was wonderful. So far, so good, right? That night I'm at dinner, and an Indian man sits next to me. Now this struck me as odd, as there were several empty seats available. He strikes up a conversation, introduces himself, and says that he's traveling with his elderly parents, sister, and her family. He's 26, works in communications, and attended college in London. He seemed nice, and we have a lovely conversation, and I throw in there that I'm happily married and have a child. Finally, his family arrives to eat. We part ways. I figure that I'll never see him again. The next day I set off at our port. I signed up for a Segway tour, and who do I see in line? My new friend and his father, and I assume his oldest nephew. He of course waves at me. We make simple chit-chat before starting our tour. After the tour, there was the opportunity to walk around. I chose to browse the shops and get some pizza. However, I felt like I was being watched or even followed. I turned around a few times, but I didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off and then went about my day. I go back to the ship change into my bathing suit and then go lay out on the deck. It's a perfect 72-degree day, and my skin loved the vitamin D. I ordered a drink, put in my wireless headphones. I'm dozing off when I feel hands roughly shake me. I jolt sitting straight up. It's my friend, although he's frowning, staring at me disapproving. He angrily tells me that I'm not allowed to show off my body, and that I'm disrespecting him and his religion by acting like a slut. By now I have 2 cruise employees that I'm friends with. I've taken many cruises, and I get to know the employees, who hear this commotion and are telling him that he needs to leave me alone. Never mind, I'm embarrassed. I tell him I'm a married woman, and what I do isn't any of his concern. As he stomps off, he informs me if I was his woman, I'd be sorry. I figured I won't have to deal with him, and the next day is just perfect. No sign of him. We are at sea, and I hang out on my balcony, sunning and dozing off. That night, after a few martinis at the piano bar, I settle in my room for the night after talking with my hubby through Facebook Messenger. I'm about to doze off when my door starts shaking. It sounds as if someone is violently running into my door. I throw a robe on and look out the peephole. It's the Indian guy, and he looks crazed. It was a formal night, so he's in formal wear, hair moosed, red-faced, screaming profanities at me. Luckily, the guy across the hall, who happens to be a pretty big guy, opens up his door, and tells the creep to get the hell out of the hall before the kids were waking up. Indian guy gives one last profanity, and then he leaves. The next morning, the guy across the hall tells me something terrifying. He swears the guy had a steak knife in his hand. I inform the cruise director, but I'm not sure what happened after that. I only saw him one more time on the cruise as we were disembarking. He was carrying one of his nieces, and luckily, he didn't see me. I was early for college, and I, a very late social bloomer, met an upperclassman while late registering for a couple of classes on a very bright, perfect fall day. He was tall, lots of curly dark hair, and the kind of trim beard that I liked. He even smelled good. Our conversation culminated in agreeing to exchange phone numbers and then go out. I was pumped, as my high school had been a small one, and dating anyone from there felt like incest because everyone knew everyone else. And really, most of them were related too. The beard wasn't on his neck. Oh no. The external beard was neat and perfect, but the internal beard lurked on the greasy neck of his fedora, which I was neither socially or spiritually advanced enough to see. The next day he showed up at my dorm room, and I assumed that we'd go somewhere from there, as had been implied by our agreement earlier. Instead of going out, he said that he needed to just stay there for some unspecified reason. I said sure, didn't think a lot about it. Maybe he had a class soon, or was waiting to catch a ride. I was willing to make up all sorts of harmless reasons for him, because I was still in the habit of giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. I offered him a drink of whatever mid-level wine I illegally had in my dorm room, because no one in that dorm would ever have an alcohol-free room at any age. He took the glass, and then drank, but somehow a little got on his sweater. It was white wine, and wouldn't have stained a patterned dark brown ski sweater, but he seemed to panic. He angrily, frantically demanded various things to clean it, and seemed paranoid at the slightest smell of it lingering. Once he got settled down again, he wanted to sit closer, and apparently calm himself with some wet kissing, catching me by surprise. I tried to go along with it because at that time I was still trying to force myself to be physically interested in other people. But I've always been nauseated by wet mouth parts touching. I was struggling with that when his teeth touched mine, and I sort of gagged and leaned back to grab the bottle of wine to rinse out my mouth with a deep sanitizing of fruit-flavored alcohol. He took these protestations as an invitation to run his hands all over my breasts and try to lean in for more. I turned my head and swilled down some more of the wine, and I made like I was about to carelessly slosh it around. He flinched back and stared for a bit, like he didn't get it, so I told him it was time for my roommate to return for the night. The prospect of someone seeing him there did it. He grabbed his backpack, cursed a little bit more about the sweater, and then he took off, not to be seen again. Thankfully, almost. A few years later, I was still living with the same roommate, as I pursued some post-grad studies, and she was getting her second degree. We rented a place a few miles out of town, and were selling some things to reduce the amount of unused crap that we had around. He showed up in response to the ad to look at a pair of cross-country skis, and I knew who he was right away, but I kept it to myself. That soul beard had indeed migrated from his aura to his internal neck. He had nearly doubled in weight, and still wore sweaters even in warm weather. He hung around for a little while talking about the skis, and wanted to pay an insulting fraction of the already low asking price. We turned down the offer, and he went on his way, because he still had the phone number from the ad, and because neckbeards are drawn to me like chewed gum is drawn to the underside of a desk. He called back later, told me he was sure he knew me from somewhere, and that wherever that was, he was sure that he really liked me, and then he asked me out. At this point, I apparently gave the phone such a dismayed, horrified look, my roommate started to laugh at me. I assured him that we didn't know each other, and then said bye. Those of us who came slowly into these kind of social interactions might feel like they have to be nice, and meekly deflect a gross situation like I did, all in the name of good manners. But it's your right to set personal boundaries, and don't forget that. I was working night duty with another girl in the Florence and Nightingale ward, and we looked after 30 patients who were behind curtains. We heard the big doors open very clearly because they were massive and made a very distinct noise. We both assumed that it was the night sister doing her rounds. We were waiting for her to poke her head through one of the curtains and say hello to us. We eventually grew suspicious after not seeing or hearing anything. So we looked out from behind the curtain, and we saw this thing that looked like an old nurse making its way up the ward. The person that we saw was wearing the old-style big hat, an old uniform with the cape, and we could only see the figure from the knees up. As it turns out, many people had seen the same thing, and it was believed that this was the ghost of the old night nurse still doing her rounds. The reason that we could only see her from the knees up was because the floor had been renovated, and she was still walking on the old floor, below the one that we're actually walking on. The ghost of this nurse was well known in this hospital, and everyone saw her every so often, and we believe that it was just an old nurse walking on her ward in her time. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night, and I'll see you next time.